After 168 years in print, Britain's News of the World is no more. But the scandal about the reporting methods that led to the newspaper's closure is continuing and spreading. The focus has been on Rupert Murdoch's vast media empire. And yet what about the impact on the integrity of the news business as a whole? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. Media tycoon Rupert Murdoch is in London to try and prop up a stumbling empire. All parts of his UK media business have been under close scrutiny in the wake of the phone hacking scandal that led to the closure of his best-selling Sunday newspaper. And the storm has crossed the Atlantic, touching now on Murdoch's maze of US interests. New allegations are emerging that reporters tried to bribe New York police officers to retrieve the private phone records of 9/11 victims. A former police officer is claiming that News of the World journalists offered payment for details about those killed in the World Trade Center attack nearly a decade ago. In the UK and US, there are at least 9 reporters facing formal corruption charges, along with a number of police officers. Well, joining me now to discuss Murdoch and the media are our 3 guests. In Washington, Ilse Hoag, a senior advisor to the media watchdog and director of News Corps Watch. In Beirut, Robert Fisk, a foreign correspondent at the British newspaper The Independent. And in London, Abdullah Schleifer, a professor of journalism and senior fellow at the Center for Journalism, the American University in Cairo. Well, welcome to you all. Let's begin with Ilse Hoag in Washington. How significant is it that the issue is becoming increasingly international rather than a localized British one?
Well, I think it's quite significant if we look at all the ways that we need to hold not just Murdoch accountable, but actually have a conversation about the hegemony of global media right now. Obviously, the U.S. is a country where Murdoch worked very hard to penetrate. It's one of the few where he has dominance on the television airwaves, something that he is aspiring to, obviously, in the UK with the B-Sky B deal, as well as in the Middle East with the launch of Sky Arabia. So the fact that questions are being raised here about whether or not ordinary citizens in the U.S. were being spied upon, I think is quite significant in having a global conversation about accountability.
Abdullah Schleifer, this issue of a global conversation, how important is it?
I think it's an extraordinary issue. You know, if I could paraphrase, I believe it's Charles Dickens, this is the worst of times, this is the best of times. The worst because of the extent of the corruption, the ability, not just by News of the World journalists to tap into phones, but the ability of Murdoch to summon British politicians to sort of make them feel as if they're utterly beholden to him and don't dare criticize any of his operations, or the way he would switch back and forth. So the extent of the rot in the, not just British media, but British politics is extraordinary. And it'll be interesting to see what comes out of America. I mean, Fox News plays a very curious role in American political life. Originally was seen as a balancing to sort of the liberal tendencies of the networks. I used to work for one of them, NBC. But I mean, it's just sort of gone overboard and become an open platform for anti-Muslim racism and very extreme right-wing views and openly partisan. Yet it's the best of times, because this story was not broken by the police or the government. It was broken by journalists. It was broken by The Guardian, and with follow-ups immediately by The Telegraph, The Independent, and The Observer. And the degree of coverage, even in The Spectator. And what's interesting about it is a sort of rallying of decency, to the degree that The Telegraph editorially, of just a few days ago, will congratulate The Guardian, which has a repetation of being a left-wing paper.
But if I can just interrupt you there, Abdullah, with all those points, and go to Robert Fisk here and ask, how much of this is a feeding frenzy among competitors, and how much of it is a genuine degree of horror at the details emerging?
Well, I think, you know, you have to realize that those on the inside may not be as horrified as they tend to write, on the grounds that they had a pretty good idea what was going on originally. You know, I used to work on the Times when Murdoch bought it, and I met Murdoch several times. He was always very friendly. In fact, he didn't measure up to the sort of horrible, evil, grotesque, poisonous person as he's being made out to be in the press now. And in fact, what was the most grotesque thing about Murdoch was not that he was an intrinsically terrible person, though we may believe so now, but that the number of journalists who fell over themselves to second guess what he believed so they could have favors from him. That was the most evil part of it all, the degree to which colleagues of mine would actually start saying things they'd never believed before, and I don't think they did believe, simply because they thought that if they said it or wrote it, Murdoch would like it. And for that reason, I think there's an awful lot of fake thunder coming from various newspapers at the moment. You know, I had to fight against the Murdoch thing once he began to get his claws into the Times, and the coverage, our coverage of the Middle East began to decline, began to be less fair, more pro-Israeli, more anti-Arab, and so on. And I found colleagues of mine who had been trade unionists, lefties, people who normally would say, well, we can't allow someone like Murdoch to bully us, coming on the telex machine, this is the days before mobile phones, and saying, please, please, can we not put this paragraph in?
Well, Ilse, there's a number of issues that you touched on there, Robert Fisk, that we will return to. But Ilse Hogue in Washington, is this all about an individual mogul, or is it about the changing nature of the news media itself?
Well, look, I think that Murdoch is an extreme example of what happens when you put your personal and political agenda ahead of public welfare, and quite honestly, ahead of shareholder value. But I think that what we're seeing is an inevitable drift towards, as Robert Fisk says, kowtowing to very, very powerful people, to one person's political views being permeated through his media empire. When you see the kind of erosion of diversity in the media that we've experienced here in the States for a long time and is beginning to happen in the UK and around the world. One of the things that we've said very clearly throughout this scandal, and actually prior to when the scandal jumped the pond, as we say, is that the Brits should learn from us in their consideration of the B-Sky-B deal, that when you've got one person in charge of so much of the airwaves, in charge of the papers of note in the United States, then the erosion on the political discourse and the way that Americans are able to engage on critical issues like foreign policy, like climate change, is severely compromised. So we hope that they will learn that lesson and really take some very cautious steps in terms of the B-Sky-B deal, and we're hoping that, you know, Americans will learn from the Brits and not allow the sort of desire to get cozy with Murdoch and Les Hinton and those in power in the U.S. media to prevent us from asking the questions that need to be asked now before the scandal becomes as widespread as it was in the UK.
Well, before we take a look at the lessons learned, let's just take a closer look at the details of what's happening. Rupert Murdoch's visit to the UK comes as his News Corporation fights to save what would be its biggest deal to date. News Corporation has been in the process of buying the remaining part of the UK satellite broadcaster B-Sky-B, as has been mentioned. It currently owns 39% of the company. Last year, B-Sky-B had a turnover of $2.66 billion, and Murdoch would appear to want more than just a portion of that. But by last Friday, B-Sky-B had lost 7.5% of its value. That's close to $1.5 billion, as investors feared the deal would fail after the phone hacking scandal and with arrests of employees in parts of the Murdoch organization. The British media watchdog could even find News Corporation, quote, not fit and proper to own B-Sky-B. On top of this, Murdoch's considerable influence with UK politicians may have been seriously damaged by the scandal. And while the police in the UK continue in the investigation, what could lie ahead for the News International parent company in the US? Well, the US Justice Department is considering launching an investigation under America's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The investigation would likely focus on the allegation that News International paid police for information. Those found guilty under the Corruption Act could face jail terms of up to 5 years on each charge, and there could be a forfeiture of company assets. But at this stage, though, it seems that legal action is largely being focused on the subordinates, those who actually crossed a line, whatever that might be. But what of the responsibility of the editors and, of course, the owners, who play a major role in putting the editors in place? Robert Fisk, you mentioned working for the Times under Murdoch, under an editor appointed by him. Who must take responsibility for this scandal?
I think the guy at the top, you know, the buck stops with Murdoch. I had a very good example of this on the day when the West German government announced that the so-called Hitler diaries, allegedly the diaries of the German Führer before and during World War II, were fake, that they'd been put together after the Second World War. Now, Murdoch had announced in both my own paper, The Times, and the Sunday Times, mercifully I was not involved in it except at the very end, that these Hitler diaries were genuine. And of course, we did huge picture supplements of the Nazi regime, the Third Reich, photographs from the diaries, all of which turned out to be spurious. And I happened to be passing through the London office of the Times on my way back to Beirut from Ireland when the foreign editor seized a Reuters machine strip coming in, tore it off. It was paper in those days. It said, "Ha ha, the diaries are forgeries." And he said, "Robert, you'd better take this into the editor, Charles Douglas Hume, and I think Murdoch is there." So I took this piece of paper, and I never believed the diaries were genuine anyway, but I took it into the room because it's a very serious matter. The Times of London, the Sunday Times, under Murdoch, had announced this extraordinary exclusive. We found Hitler's diaries, and it was all fake. Went into the room, there was Douglas Hume, and I saw Murdoch on the sofa. Didn't look at him, not at that point. And then I said to Charlie Douglas Hume, he said, "Well, what's the news?" I said, "They're fake." And I heard Murdoch giggling from the sofa, and I turned round and he looked up and he said, "Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained." And that was the problem, you see. His sort of insouciance was almost attractive. It was a great story. There was just one problem with it. It wasn't true. And it was this amorality, not immorality, but this amorality that means that the man at the top has to answer for it. He didn't want to. He even made a joke about it.
Well, Abdullah Schleifer, would you pick up on that question of responsibility, of accountability of those who control or own the media?
Mike, there's no question. I think Bob is 100% correct. The buck does stop at the top, and that's what's not happening, and that people are getting very upset about it. I mean, you have the News of the World closed down. Now, I don't know the journalists at the News of the World, but let's say 50% of them, you know, new group, that had nothing to do with this. Maybe 25, whatever. That wasn't the issue. Closing down the News of the World was a form of a typical sort of evasive technique that men of great power who are amoral will exercise. What about the senior leadership and Murdoch himself? So I think there's a growing consensus in public opinion that this is what people should be pushing investigations on. Where does it lead to?
Well, we heard from Robert Fisk as well where it could lead to. The mention, to return to Robert, about an editorial change when you have a powerful media person taking charge of a newspaper. You referred to specifically a newspaper suddenly becoming pro-Israeli as opposed to anti-Arab. But at the same time, the danger, perhaps, in this is that other entities then take an opposite position and become pro-Arab at that particular risk. And the danger is that in the middle, an independent, integral media with integrity has gone. Is this a possibility that arises from extremes in media, Robert?
No, I don't think so. I think you've slightly misunderstood what happened on the paper. Although the former editor, who died of cancer, had been writing for an Arab paper, Al-Majalla magazine, I should say, and had been expressing fairly critical views of Israel. My point was that once he became the editor of the Times and worked for Murdoch, he suddenly became much more pro-Israeli, even thinking the 82 Israeli invasion of Lebanon was a good thing, an ark of peace, for goodness sake, in the Levant. And all his criticism began to melt away. The problem was that Charlie, who was a friend of mine, began to feel the pressure from Murdoch. Murdoch didn't change it. And I don't think it made the Times particularly alter other papers. The Guardian always took a fairly liberal view. The problem was that the Times until then had taken a very impartial view of the Middle East, casting out criticism and condemnation to both Arabs and to Israelis. The problem where it went wrong was it suddenly became pro-Israeli, anti-Arab. But the other papers, The Guardian, The Telegraph, which was always pretty pro-Israeli anyway, I don't think they changed. I was watching them at the time, of course. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that our paper, which had been known for generations as being a paper of integrity and impartiality, even if, as I believed it should be, it was impartial on the side of those who suffered, suddenly became a propaganda tool in which all the staff began to do what they thought Murdoch wanted.
Well, Ilse Hogue, I mean, how much of a danger of this is in the US? You talked about lessons to be learnt. We've had mention of various of Murdoch's entities within the US. What kind of impact do they have on the political scene and on the editorial lines that are being exercised at any given time?
Well, I think it's really critical to make a distinction between shaping content to fit your political agenda, which we've certainly seen at the Wall Street Journal since Murdoch's takeover. We experienced what we call the brain drain, where so many of the really established journalists who were very, very proud of their investigative history and background left, either immediately because of their concerns or subsequently because of their feeling of soft pressure, as Robert is talking about. But I think there's a key distinction to be made between that and what we've experienced with Fox News, which is the real danger on the airwaves. This is not actually about just being a conservative political propaganda machine, which of course it is. It's actually about a systematic pattern of deceptions and lies and communiques from the top, which, like we saw, my example is the Washington editor Bill Salmon actually admitting that he had instructed his news editors to link President Obama and the campaign to socialism, even though he subsequently admitted in a speech that he found the claim to be far-fetched. So you've actually got NBC, which some people will claim a liberal bias, but they are factually accurate. They are factually correct, versus Fox News, which perpetually misleads its viewers about all sorts of things, from climate change and the reality of scientific consensus on that global issue to the president's relationship to socialism. And that has a distinctly destructive impact on our democracy.
Abdullah Schleifer, do you see this type of action as spreading through the media generally, the media in the US in particular, speaking as somebody who has had experience of working for the networks there?
Well, yes. I mean, the long-term trend, with or without Murdoch, is not a good one. When I started out with NBC News, it was owned by RCA, which was a corporation, but very much related. I mean, for instance, they produce video cameras, and they would allow us to use Japanese cameras because they were better than the RCA cameras. And at that time, television news was considered sort of a public service. It just started becoming a profit center. And just look at print media. Look at the number of newspapers that have collapsed as print vehicles and now exist only online. And the destruction of family. And by family, I don't mean a sort of mafia family, where you've got blood connections and loyal to the mafia chief, which is sort of the analogy I would make with the Murdochs. I'm talking about where a family is rooted in an American town. Our media was very decentralized. It isn't like British media, which is so London-orientated. Our media was really widespread, and that has gone under. These family newspapers have disappeared. The Louisville Courier, many others. And so the long-term trend has not been a positive one. And this Murdoch thing is just a sort of exaggerated acceleration of bad news for good journalism.
Robert Fisk, your view on that point particularly put there, that this is actually part of a wider process. It's not just about an independent media mogul, it's about the media itself.
Yeah, I think it's also about families, you know. One of the things that struck me watching from the distance of the Middle East, of the Murdoch, well, hopefully a collapse, but the Murdoch crisis, is the degree to which it's a family affair. We've got Murdoch Senior, the old man, 80 years old. We've got James just ready to take over the whole company, and we've got various members of the family. One daughter owns Shine TV. And it's a bit like some of the situations out here in the Middle East where we have all these caliphs, you know, King Hassan of Morocco, then you have King Mohammed of Morocco. And we had Hafez al-Assad, and we had Bashar al-Assad. And we would have had Mubarak Hosni giving way to his son Gamal. And now we have Rupert, son of father of James Murdoch. It's almost as if this kind of caliphate, and it has the same effect because these people can maneuver. They're prime ministers, they can accuse someone of abuse, they can say you haven't done they can dismiss a governor of Hammer. Just as Murdoch's people, and Rebecca Wade or Brooks or whatever she's called, can then dismiss a whole newspaper and close it down, even though she was the editor when these things happened. There's a very sort of oddly presidential familia caliphate element to this, which we haven't actually explored, but which has a sort of rather creepily familiar ring to it out here in the Middle East.
Well, let's just explore that with Ilse Hoog, that question of dynasties running media and the impact and the power that they have in doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the points that Robert are making are key in terms of understanding how far the scandal might actually reach. I mean, you have to understand, we are already looking at a company that's been rocked by shareholder allegations of nepotism around the acquisition of Elizabeth Murdoch's company Shine at what some analysts say is 3 times the value of the company. And shareholders were not pleased by that. Shareholders are not pleased by the shutting down of News of the World, which was a very profitable organization in order to serve what I believe is the extended family, right? What we've seen is a pattern of Murdoch's, not only his children, but his loyalists being elevated in the context of this crisis. Les Hinton, who obviously oversaw News of the World at the time that the hacking was at its peak, was then elevated to become the CEO of Dow Jones, which controls the Wall Street Journal. This fact alone shows that Murdoch will maintain his inner circle in power, even when it's at expense to the shareholders and the common good. And it also points to the fact that the same people were in charge in the UK, presiding over this scandal, have a lot of power in the US, which requires us to ask questions. And I think the role of James Murdoch is critically important. He's the heir apparent. He was very caught up in this scandal. And, you know, the board is going to have its job to do in terms of finding an appropriate independent successor who can clean up this organization.
But Abdullah Schleifer in London, who should regulate this? At what point does regulation of the media to try and avoid this type of excess become censorship of the medium? Where is the responsibility for stopping this from happening?
That's a very complex question, which is being debated right now in the British press. On one hand, self-regulation appears to have failed. On the other hand, if you move it outside of the world of journalism, you know, outside of the newspapers, even if you call it an independent commission, then it's very vulnerable to government intervention. I don't know the answer. I mean, it's something that has to be thrashed out and considered with a seriousness that means more than just writing a lead editorial for today or tomorrow, because it is tricky. It's always been the case in any form of regulation. Very often, our regulatory agencies in America, which played a wonderful role in the 1930s and 40s, but in the last 2 decades, well, have either been bought out by the very private sectors as opposed to police. I don't know the answer, and it requires debate.
Well, Robert Fisk, as we run out of time here, do you have an answer to that?
Yes. Why aren't the readers the commission? All readers have to do when they see immorality, criminality, or anything else is stop buying the paper, switch off the television, refuse to watch Sky or Fox News or read the News of the World. They can't do that anymore, or The Sun in London. Why not let the readers say, look, you have a morality, you have opinions. If you don't like this guy and you don't like what you're reading or you think it's lies, your judgment comes first. Without all these controlling government agencies, whether the reader can do that or the viewer, I don't know.
Ilse Hoog, very briefly, your view on that.
First, we need to determine the extent of the criminal allegations in the states and everywhere. That starts with our Congress and Department of Justice. And second, we need to actually look at the laws that govern media ownership, and we need to get back to a diversity of voices in the media marketplace, or else our democracy is going to be in peril.
Well, thank you so much to our guests, Ilse Hoog, Robert Fisk, and Abdullah Schleifer. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.